Welcome, dear friends, to the quiet village of Marleycombe, where winter lies gently upon the rooftops and narrow lanes. Frost sparkles along hedgerows, and the scent of wood smoke curls from every chimney. Inside parlors, fires crackle cheerfully, and porcelain teacups tremble with steam upon lace-covered tables. Church bells toll softly in the distance, as though keeping time with the hush of falling snow. Yet beneath this tranquil charm stirs a mystery, our tale, the mystery behind the love of mistress for poison. Tell me, dear listeners, do you believe love can be sweet comfort, or the deadliest danger? The winter fete of Marleycombe had always been a scene of merriment, where the village gathered to share laughter, games, and the sweetness of the season. Children's skates cut neat patterns upon the frozen pond, their shrieks of delight mingling with the distant peal of church bells. Stalls brimmed with plum cake, sugared biscuits, and steaming bowls of spiced punch, while ladies in woolen coats exchanged pleasantries over hot tea poured into delicate porcelain cups. It was in the very heart of this cheer that calamity struck. Mrs. Lydia Harrington, well regarded and much observed within the parish, lifted her painted violet teacup with an elegant hand. She smiled, perhaps at a private thought, and sipped. A moment later, a scream tore across the fete. The cup slipped from her grasp, shattering upon the frosted ground, its dark contents seeping like ink into the snow. Gasps rippled through the crowd, chatter dissolving into fear. Some muttered about frailty, others whispered of something darker, poison. A sudden shadow seemed to fall across the merriment, as if winter itself had turned hostile. Among the anxious faces, one pair of eyes lingered not on the woman, but upon the fallen teacup, calm, sharp, and quietly knowing, Miss Marple's. Chapter 1. Whispers over Seed Cake. It was often said that nothing in Marleycombe spread as swiftly as the scent of seed cake at Mrs. Pembroke's tea shop, except perhaps the scent of gossip. That morning, with snow still banked along the lane and the church clock striking 10, the little establishment was crowded to the brim. Every chair seemed occupied, every small table crowded with teapots, plates of currant buns, and, most importantly, whispering voices. The talk was of nothing but the fate. Some began with concern, "Poor Mrs. Harrington, such a frightful turn," while others leaned forward with glinting eyes, eager to suggest more sinister explanations. "She was never a strong woman," declared Mrs. Finch, pursing her lips over her teacup. "A weak constitution, that's what it is. Bound to give way in the cold." "Nonsense," interrupted Mr. Bradley from the corner, his voice thick with relish. "I heard she'd enemies a-plenty. A woman with jewels like that, and a sharp tongue besides. Mark my words, someone wanted her out of the way." Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively near the fire, continued her knitting with serene fingers. Her pale blue eyes drifted from speaker to speaker, not so much hearing the words as weighing the manner in which they were delivered. Mrs. Finch spoke too hastily, as though eager to shut down any darker suggestion. Mr. Bradley, on the other hand, seemed to revel in the prospect of scandal. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was never quite so revealing as when gossip turned dangerous. Between the polite clink of spoons and the fragrant steam of tea, a picture formed, half speculation, half confession. Mrs. Harrington had scolded her maid cruelly. She had quarrelled with Lady Caroline over an heirloom. She had received letters, odd and unsigned. Each tale was passed along with the relish of fresh scandal, each contradiction ignored in the excitement of telling. "Of course," sighed Mrs. Pembroke, bustling past with a tray of seed cake, "it may have been nothing more than a fainting spell. Though," and here her voice dropped significantly, "I did hear the doctor mutter something about poison." The words seemed to freeze the air in the shop. Knives and forks paused. Cups hovered halfway to lips. Eyes darted, then quickly looked away. Miss Marple, calm as ever, shifted her ball of wool and thought how very curious it was to see who grew pale, who stiffened, and who forced an easy laugh. It was then that the door burst open, letting in a flurry of snow and a gust of cold air. A maid, flushed, breathless, scarcely able to speak, stood in the doorway. All conversation hushed at once. "I heard it," she gasped, clutching her apron. "I heard someone say, 'She had it coming.'" The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of fear and speculation through every heart. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly on, but her eyes, bright and thoughtful, lifted from her work at last. Miss Marple, though outwardly absorbed in her knitting, let the gossip swirl about her like so many leaves blown by the winter wind. She had learned long ago that when people talk freely, the truth often lies not in what is said, but in what is carefully left unsaid. The maid's breathless declaration still hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. "She had it coming," a phrase simple enough, yet weighted with suggestion. Who would dare speak such words about Lydia Harrington, a woman both admired and feared? Miss Marple's needles moved with steady rhythm, her mind arranging and rearranging the puzzle. She thought of the many times she had seen small grievances blossom into something darker. Jealousies among cousins that began with borrowed dresses and ended with lifelong estrangement. Neighborly quarrels over hedges and hens that soured into bitterness carried for decades. Even quiet affections, when spurned, could turn as sharp as nettles. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was a soil both rich and treacherous, yielding roses and poison side by side. She observed the company with care. Whenever the talk strayed toward Lady Caroline, chairs shifted and glances darted away, as though her name carried something dangerous. And when young Alice Pritchard, sitting near the window, heard the word poison, she grew so pale that Miss Marple feared she might faint. Alice pressed her teacup to her lips to steady her trembling, but the porcelain rattled against her teeth. Most curious, thought Miss Marple. People often betray themselves not with bold statements, but with silence, or with the small betrayals of body and face. She recalled an old story from her own village of St. Mary Mead, how a woman who could never bring herself to speak her neighbor's name was discovered, at last, to have been hiding a rather dreadful secret. Such things bore remembering. Miss Marple let her eyes rest kindly upon Alice, who managed a wan smile before turning away. It was, Miss Marple decided, not guilt she had glimpsed, but fear. Fear of what, she wondered? Fear for whom? Around the tables, voices rose once more, each account growing more elaborate. One insisted Lydia Harrington had enemies enough to fill the church pews. Another declared it was simply a matter of frailty and the winter chill. All the while, Miss Marple knitted and listened, quietly sifting wheat from chaff. And then, with a suddenness that silenced every tongue, the door opened once again. This time it was not a maid, nor a curious villager, but two uniformed policemen, their boots leaving wet marks on Mrs. Pembroke's polished floor. The taller of the two cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone heavy with authority, "you may cease your speculations. We have reason to believe we already know who is responsible for Mrs. Harrington's sudden collapse." The words struck the room like a clap of thunder. Teacups froze mid-air. Every head turned. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. The yarn stretched between them like a held breath. Chapter 2. The Maid in Custody. The atmosphere inside Mrs. Pembroke's tea-shop, already thick with gossip, grew heavier still as the policeman's words sank in. It was as though every villager had been waiting for the hammer to fall, and now, with grim satisfaction, they leaned closer, hungry for the name. It came quickly enough. Clara. Clara, the maid who had served Mrs. Harrington faithfully for nearly 5 years. Clara, the same girl who had once been scolded in the marketplace so loudly that passers-by had paused in discomfort. A harsh reprimand, everyone remembered, for some imagined carelessness with the silver. That moment now resurfaced, retold with relish. Well, if you ask me, a servant never forgets humiliation. By mid-afternoon the news spread along Marleycomb's cobbled streets. Clara had been taken into custody. The constable, red-cheeked with self-importance, was overheard saying it was a clear case. Means, motive, and opportunity. She had been near the refreshments, she had reason for resentment, and poison was easily concealed. What more could one need? The villagers murmured their agreement, some with pity, others with grim satisfaction. "Of course it was her," said Mr. Bradley with a solemn nod, as though he had suspected it all along. "Servants, you know, they bear grudges. She was bound to do something rash one day." Miss Marple, seated by the fire, continued her knitting with the faintest crease of concentration between her brows. She had watched Clara's arrest from the corner of her eye, the girl's cheeks wet with tears, her words tumbling out in frantic denial. There had been no guile in that desperate voice, Miss Marple thought, only bewilderment and fear. Human nature could be very cunning indeed, but Clara's trembling hands and wide eyes did not ring of calculation. The old lady allowed herself a small sigh. It was not the first time she had seen justice rush to judgment. In her mind, she recalled a case from years before, when a gardener had been accused of theft simply because no one could imagine a gentleman doing such a thing. And yet, it had been the gentleman after all. Appearances, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely the truth. Still, the tide of village opinion was against Clara. Whispers rustled like dry leaves in the winter wind, that she had been seen sulking in the kitchen, that she had once muttered about leaving, that she resented her mistress's sharp tongue. Each story grew more embroidered with each telling. Then, as if to seal the matter, Mrs. Larkin, a neighbor with a flair for drama, swept into the tea-shop with eyes wide and lips pursed. She lowered her voice, though it carried easily to every corner. "I saw her," she declared. "I saw Clara, plain as day, standing near the tea-table just before Mrs. Harrington collapsed." The room gasped as one. Even the kettle seemed to pause in its whistle. Miss Marple's needles clicked together, and for a moment she did not move at all. Her eyes, cool and thoughtful, rested upon Mrs. Larkin, as though she found the certainty of the woman's claim more curious than the claim itself. Miss Marple had never placed much trust in the neat conclusions of authority. She respected the constabulary, of course, but she knew from long acquaintance with human failings that justice often hurried where it ought to tread softly. The picture painted of Clara was too convenient, too easily embraced by villagers eager for certainty. When she was granted a few minutes to speak with the girl, Miss Marple approached not as a stern inquisitor, but with the quiet patience of one accustomed to coaxing truth from the most timid of lips. Clara sat upon a wooden bench, eyes swollen from crying, her hands twisting at the corner of her apron. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and for the first time her sobs stilled. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, lowering herself onto the bench beside her, "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity. Tell me, on the morning of the fete, what errands occupied you?" Clara sniffed, fumbling for words. I was sent to the grocer, ma'am, for flour and suet. Mrs. Harrington wanted the pudding perfect. After that I polished the silver, laid out her scarf, and fetched the violets from a hothouse. I never touched the tea, I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, the needles of her mind clicking as surely as her knitting ones. The account had the ring of truth, untidy, detailed, full of the small tasks that mark a servant's day. "And your mistress," Miss Marple prompted softly. "Had she seemed herself?" Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. "She was distracted, ma'am. Kept looking at a letter she'd received 2 days before. Strange thing it was, green wax on the seal. She stared at it as though it troubled her, yet when I asked if she wanted it locked in the desk, she snapped that it was nothing." "Green wax," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "That is not common, is it?" "No, ma'am," Clara whispered. "I never saw it again after that. I thought perhaps she burned it, but when I went to tidy her writing-table yesterday, the envelope was gone altogether." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind sharpened. Letters had a way of opening more than paper. They opened secrets. She remembered a girl in another parish who had been condemned by her neighbors because of an overheard quarrel, only for a letter to reveal the truth. The girl had been innocent, the culprit another entirely. So often it was appearances that deceived, and paper that revealed. She patted Clara's hand. "You have been most helpful, my dear. Never fear, truth has a way of surfacing, though it may take a little patience." Yet as Miss Marple stepped back into the frosty air of Marleycombe, her thoughts circled uneasily. A letter sealed with green wax vanished without trace. If it had been destroyed, why had Clara seen no ashes? If it had been hidden, by whose hand? One fact stood out clearly. The letter was gone. Entirely gone. And in that disappearance lay the first true shadow of doubt. Chapter 3. Shadows at the Vicarage. The vicarage of Marleycombe had always been a place of comfort, its ivy-clad walls and tidy rose garden suggesting nothing more sinister than Sunday sermons and the occasional parish meeting. Yet when Miss Marple was invited to take tea with Reverend Elwood, she could not fail to notice the faint strain etched into the lines of his kindly face. His usually steady hands trembled as he poured the tea, slopping a little onto the saucer. "I must confess, Miss Marple," he began, voice low, "that this business with poor Mrs. Harrington has unsettled the village more deeply than any snowstorm or sermon could. And there is," he hesitated, glancing toward the study door, "another matter." Miss Marple, demure behind her teacup, waited. She knew better than to press a man already on the edge of confession. At last he rose, fetched a drawer from his desk, and produced several folded scraps of paper. These, you see, arrived over the past fortnight. Anonymous. Each warning of sin, cloaked in the garments of devotion. Ugly words, Miss Marple, accusatory, though never specific. She examined one, her eyes narrowing slightly at the jagged handwriting. Beware the false purity of one whose prayers mask darker desires. Another read, Love dressed as virtue may yet poison the soul. How very curious, she murmured, fingers smoothing the page. And they arrived before Mrs. Harrington's death? The vicar nodded gravely. Indeed. I thought them merely the work of some mischief-maker. But now, his gaze dropped to the letters as though they might burn him. Outside, the toll of the church bell floated faintly, solemn as an undertaker. Miss Marple considered the implications. Such venom rarely sprang from nowhere. It usually traced its roots to jealousy, bitterness, or an inconvenient truth whispered in private. Her thoughts wandered, inevitably, to Mrs. Harrington herself. The lady had always been admired for her elegance, but admiration can sour into envy. And there had been whispers, hadn't there, of her fondness for Edward Pritchard, the scholarly young man with a penchant for verse and a talent for reciting it in mellifluous tones. He was seen often at her garden table in the summer, book in hand, while she laughed far more freely than she did with her husband's old friends. A woman of Mrs. Harrington's position befriending a much younger man was bound to spark wagging tongues. The vicar refilled her cup, though absent-mindedly, as though the steam rising from the pot was merely a distraction. Do you think these notes, could they be tied to her death? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking once more as she resumed her knitting. My dear Reverend, human malice seldom keeps to tidy compartments. Letters, gossip, poison, it is all of a piece, if one but finds the thread. Later that afternoon, as she strolled through the churchyard, Miss Marple happened upon two parish ladies standing near the lych-gate, their cloaks drawn close against the chill. They leaned together, voices low but not low enough to escape her sharp ear. "It was love that killed her," one whispered, eyes darting nervously. "Love steeped in poison." Miss Marple walked on, her expression mild, but her mind was anything but tranquil. Edward Pritchard had always cut a rather striking figure in Marleycombe. His dark hair fell untidily over his brow. His spectacles perched at an angle that suggested he was more at home in the dust of a library than in the drawing-rooms of society. He spoke with a poet's cadence, full of lofty words and earnest feeling, which caused matrons to nod indulgently and young women to sigh. Yet, when Miss Marple invited him to sit with her that frosty afternoon, none of his usual charm seemed present. He fidgeted with his gloves, twisting them into a cord between his fingers. Mrs. Harrington was a woman of refinement, Miss Marple. I admired her greatly, as any man might admire beauty and intellect combined. But impropriety. His eyes widened behind his spectacles. Never. Miss Marple inclined her head, neither agreeing nor contradicting. And on the day of the fete, my dear boy, where were you then? At the library. He spoke too quickly, as though the answer had been rehearsed. I was consulting an obscure volume on Tudor verse. The librarian will confirm it. She observed the way his eyes dropped to the floorboards, the nervous shuffle of his foot. It reminded her of a boy she once knew in St. Mary Mead, who had broken a sugar bowl and attempted to hide the shards beneath a rug. His mother, of course, discovered them at once, and the boy's trembling lip betrayed him long before the evidence was found. "Such devotion to study," Miss Marple murmured kindly. "And yet you seem uneasy. Surely reading poetry is not a crime." Edward flushed. It was a sensitive matter. People misinterpret closeness between friends, especially when the world insists on scandal. He glanced toward the window, where frost had begun to paint lace-like patterns on the glass. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her needles clicking softly. Nervous souls often rushed to fill silences, and Edward did not disappoint. "She was lonely, you see," he blurted. "A woman of her station, yes, but still lonely. I read to her, that was all. We spoke of books, of gardens, of—" He stopped, realizing he had said too much. "Of letters, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked mildly. His brow furrowed. "Letters? No. At least," he faltered, then straightened his back with sudden resolve. "No, I know nothing of that." Later, as Edward gathered his coat to depart, a small sound caught Miss Marple's ear, the faint crackle of paper as the garment shifted. A constable, standing nearby, noticed it too. He stepped forward, reached into the inner pocket, and withdrew a crumpled scrap. It was no ordinary paper. Upon its surface clung a fragment of wax, green wax, unmistakably. Edward's face drained of color. I cannot explain," he stammered, but his words stumbled into silence. Miss Marple's eyes, calm as a pond yet sharp as broken glass, rested upon the scrap in the constable's hand. The missing letter had left behind its trace, and that trace had found its way into the young scholar's coat. The village's whispers of poison suddenly sharpened into accusation. Chapter 4. Lilies on the Snow. Snow lay like lace upon Marleycomb's hedgerows, softening the cottages and making even the most modest doorsteps appear touched by elegance. Yet beneath the beauty of that winter morning, a new note of discord was stirring. Whispers had shifted away from scholars and servants, fastening instead upon the strained friendship between Mrs. Harrington and Lady Caroline Ashworth. It was a tale the villagers told with relish, for there is no story so delicious as that of friends turned adversaries. Years ago, Lady Caroline and Mrs. Harrington had been near inseparable, walking arm in arm to church, arranging flowers for the altar, and sharing confidences over seed cake in the tea shop. But all that had soured when a distant cousin passed away, leaving a fine collection of jewels. The inheritance, by quirk of will, had gone to Lydia Harrington. Many in the village remarked that Lady Caroline had fully expected the heirloom pearls herself. Outwardly, the ladies maintained civility. They nodded politely across pews and exchanged brief pleasantries at garden parties. Yet there was always a tension in the air when they stood near one another, as though each word spoken was balanced upon the edge of something sharp. "Mark my words," muttered Mrs. Phelps, the grocer's wife, while weighing out raisins for a Christmas pudding. "A quarrel over jewels never truly ends. It festers." Others agreed with solemn nods, suggesting that resentment, quiet, unacknowledged, might explain the bitterness whispered of in Lady Caroline's house. Miss Marple, who understood well that human nature rarely let go of grudges, resolved to call upon Lady Caroline herself. She walked the short lane toward the great house, her breath rising like smoke against the clear, cold air. The Ashworth residence, with its tall chimneys and shuttered windows, looked imposing even under the softest blanket of snow. A maid admitted her, somewhat reluctantly, and Miss Marple found her way to the drawing-room. It was a high-ceilinged space, filled with gilt-framed portraits and heavy curtains. But what drew Miss Marple's sharp eyes was the fire blazing in the hearth. Lady Caroline, still elegant in widow's black though her hair was silver, stood before it, her gloved hands feeding sheets of paper into the flames. For a moment the crackle of burning filled the silence, accompanied by the acrid scent of melting wax seals. The flames devoured one letter after another, curling the edges into black lace before swallowing them whole. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Lady Caroline started, her usual poise cracking just enough to betray surprise. She closed the fire-screen hastily, though not before Miss Marple saw the last corner of a letter vanish into smoke. "My dear lady," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, settling into a chair without invitation, "what a cheerfully warm fire on so bitter a day." Lady Caroline's eyes flickered, uncertain, perhaps even guilty. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and pure, while inside the drawing-room secrets turned to ash. Miss Marple had long believed that nowhere did envy and spite hide so snugly as beneath the surface of cordial friendship. In St. Mary Mead, she had once watched two ladies take tea together every Tuesday for 20 years, smiling sweetly, though each resented the other bitterly for possessing the handsomer garden. "Human nature never alters," she would remark, and it was with this thought in mind that she studied Lady Caroline Ashworth now. Lady Caroline, tall and imperious despite her widow's garb, reclined upon her chaise with a composure that seemed almost rehearsed. "You mustn't imagine, Miss Marple," she said smoothly, "that Lydia and I were ever enemies. Differences arise in every friendship, but one forgives, one moves on. I certainly have nothing to hide." Her voice was calm, yet her gloved fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the arm of her chair. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, said nothing, merely nodding as if in agreement. Silence was often more telling than questions. It was the maid, young Elsie with bright eyes and nervous manner, who betrayed more than her mistress intended. Bringing in a tray of steaming tea, she hesitated at the doorway, then blurted, "Beg pardon, ma'am, but wasn't it Mrs. Harrington who said she'd tell?" She stopped abruptly, paling as though she had stepped into a pool far deeper than expected. Lady Caroline's eyes sharpened. "That will be all, Elsie," she said crisply. The maid departed, cheeks flushed, but her words lingered in the air like the faint smoke of burnt paper. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, mild yet probing. "Tell what, I wonder?" she asked softly. Lady Caroline did not answer. Instead, she busied herself with pouring tea, her hands unsteady just enough for a few drops to stain the lace-cloth. By evening, the village hummed with speculation. Mrs. Harrington threatening to expose a dreadful secret? What could it mean? Some whispered of financial impropriety, others of indiscreet affections. "Blackmail," murmured the butcher's wife knowingly. "Jewels and greed, that's the heart of it." And thus suspicion turned its gaze from servants and scholars toward the aristocratic Lady Caroline. But even as tongues wagged and theories spun, fate delivered another shock to Marleycombe. It happened 2 days later, at a quiet gathering in the vicarage hall. The same violet-patterned tea service, brought out for the occasion, was filled and passed among the guests. Edward Pritchard, the young scholar, raised his cup with trembling hands, perhaps to soothe his frayed nerves. Moments later, a choking gasp escaped his lips. The cup clattered from his fingers, shattering upon the stone floor. His face drained of all color as he collapsed backward in his chair. Cries rang out, chairs scraped, and the vicar shouted for aid. Panic spread like wildfire through the hall, for the dreadful truth seemed inescapable. Death had not finished its visit to Marleycombe. Miss Marple rose swiftly, her sharp eyes fixed upon the fallen cup. "Twice," she murmured under her breath, "from the same service." And in that instant, the cozy hush of village life gave way to something far darker. Chapter 5. The Poison Spreads. For a time, it seemed that Edward Pritchard's life hung in a balance as fragile as the frost glittering upon Marleycombe's hedgerows. He had collapsed so suddenly in the vicarage hall that many were convinced he had followed Mrs. Harrington into death. Yet fortune, or Providence, had intervened. The vicar's wife, quick-thinking and practical, summoned the village doctor without delay. After long hours of pale anxiety, it was declared that Edward would recover, though weak and shaken. The village, however, did not recover so easily. Fear, once sown, spreads like ivy along a wall. Everywhere one went, people murmured about poison, in the tea shop, at the baker's, even while queuing for coal. "It could be anywhere," declared Mrs. Phelps, eyes wide as she clutched her marketing basket. "Lurking in cups, creeping into food, why, even the seed cake isn't safe." Housewives inspected their larders with suspicion, and more than one family abandoned tea altogether, preferring plain water. The police, eager to demonstrate control, posted constables at the vicarage and at the Harrington residence. Inspector Graves announced with stern authority that Clara, the maid already in custody, must have had accomplices. "Such a plot cannot be managed by one simple girl," he insisted, his voice carrying across the green where villagers gathered to listen. "Mark me, the guilty will be found." But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her usual place at the tea shop with her knitting bag at her side, was not convinced. She had seen Clara's tear-streaked face, the desperate protests that rang of truth rather than deceit. And she knew, with a certainty born of long years observing human nature, that wickedness often sprang not from grand conspiracies, but from intimate resentments, small slights magnified into cruelty. "It is not accomplices we must seek," she murmured softly to herself, "but the hand closest to the heart." Her thoughts wandered to the strange letters, the rivalry with Lady Caroline, the pale expression of the scholar when pressed, and the curious fact that both victims had drunk from the same service. She thought, too, of the village gardens, where foxglove bells nodded innocently in the summer months, their beauty concealing danger. Later, in the quiet of her sitting-room, Miss Marple unfolded a slip of paper delivered discreetly by the doctor. His notes, written in neat hand, confirmed her suspicion. The substance that had nearly claimed Edward's life was not some crude household powder, but tincture of digitalis, foxglove, carefully distilled, precise in dose, and most certainly prepared by a hand that knew what it was about. She paused, her needles momentarily still. Foxglove was a plant every village child could name, but the art of preparing it into tincture, that was knowledge of a more deliberate sort. Someone, somewhere in Marleycombe, had taken beauty from the garden and turned it into a weapon. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside, her eyes thoughtful and grave. "Yes," she whispered, "this is not a matter of chance. It is a matter of intention." And intention, she knew, was the very heart of murder. The discovery of foxglove tincture set Miss Marple's thoughts spinning like dry leaves in a winter gust. In her long acquaintance with gardens, she had always admired the tall, bell-shaped blooms of the plant, so stately, so deceptively innocent with their purple and white spires. Children loved to slip the blossoms over their fingers like thimbles, never guessing that within their beauty lay a danger capable of stopping the human heart. It was not idle knowledge to Miss Marple. She remembered, with startling clarity, Mrs. Harrington's own garden in high summer. While roses sprawled exuberantly and lavender filled the air with perfume, it was the foxgloves that stood in ordered ranks by the south wall. Mrs. Harrington, fastidious in her ways, had always prided herself on their careful cultivation. Miss Marple herself had once been shown the flowers with great ceremony, Lydia pointing out their unusual height and rich coloring as though they were rare jewels. The question now was, who had access? A gardener, perhaps, for the grounds of Harrington House were extensive and kept neat by a pair of sturdy men. Or a family member, though Mrs. Harrington's relations were few and seldom seen. Then again, in a village like Marleycombe, gardens were hardly private. Children strayed through gates, neighbors exchanged cuttings, and visitors admired beds as freely as they breathed. Still, Miss Marple knew that the use of foxglove tincture was no careless act. The preparation required precision, too weak a dose, and it would cause no more than a faint spell, too strong, and death would follow with terrible swiftness. This was the work of someone knowledgeable, deliberate, and patient, traits which spoke volumes about character. One afternoon, wrapped in her shawl against the snow, Miss Marple paused at the edge of Harrington House Gardens. There she observed the new gardener, an earnest young man with red cheeks, clipping dead heads from rose bushes. His hands were clumsy, his movements heavy. He looked the sort who might mend a fence or dig a trench, but not one to measure tinctures with care. No, this particular hand was not precise enough. It was later, in the vicarage library, that Miss Marple's musings took a sharper turn. In conversation with the local chemist, Mr. Rowley, who had been called to examine the Harrington medicine chest, a curious detail emerged. "Strange thing, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Only last month, Mrs. Harrington herself ordered 3 small bottles of tincture, digitalis, as a tonic for her heart," she claimed. "Paid in full, with her own hand." Miss Marple's needles paused in midair. "Ordered it herself? Indeed. And what's more, I cannot account for what became of those bottles. None were found in her cupboards. The air seemed to grow colder. So Lydia Harrington had possessed the poison before it ever touched her lips. Whether by precaution, habit, or something more secretive, she had invited danger into her home. Miss Marple folded her knitting slowly, her mind already weaving threads tighter. "How very curious," she murmured. "How very curious indeed." Chapter 6. Tea by Candlelight. The vicarage had always been a place of comfort, its rooms lined with worn books and smelling faintly of beeswax and baking bread. Yet on that particular evening, when the villagers gathered around the long oak table for supper, an air of unease lingered, clinging as stubbornly as smoke after a fire. Candles burned in tall brass sticks, their flames flickering against the stone walls, throwing shadows that seemed to nod and whisper along with the guests. Miss Marple, sitting quietly near the hearth, her knitting folded in her lap, observed as she always did, not the words themselves, but the pauses between them, the fleeting glances that darted like sparrows, the slight tremor in a voice when certain subjects arose. The meal was simple: cold meats, bread, and a pudding made by the vicar's wife. Yet it was not food that nourished the room. It was gossip, thick and filling as any stew. Lady Caroline spoke too quickly, as though rehearsed, of Lydia Harrington's kind heart and generosity of spirit. Her fingers, however, tapped nervously against her wine-glass, betraying the lie. Across the table, young Edward Pritchard kept his eyes lowered, his spoon stirring a pudding he did not taste. The maid's name was mentioned, Clara, still imprisoned, and a hush fell. Several guests nodded gravely, muttering that justice would soon be done, though one or two shifted in their chairs as if the verdict weighed heavily upon them. Miss Marple's mind, neat and orderly as her knitting patterns, began to align the threads she had gathered, the quarrel over jewels, the whispered threat of dreadful secrets, the curious order of foxglove tincture, the letters sealed in green wax. Each detail glimmered like a stitch in a tapestry, faint alone but together forming a picture. And yet the picture was not quite complete. Some stitches still floated, unanchored. She sipped her tea, the porcelain warm against her thin fingers, and glanced around the table. It was often in the act of breaking bread, or, in this case, breaking seed cake, that people revealed themselves most honestly. A careless remark, a guarded silence, the slip of a pronoun could undo 1,000 careful lies. As the vicar raised his glass to toast "Peace in our troubled times," Miss Marple felt the temperature of the room shift. A draught, sudden and sharp, licked at the candles. The flames shuddered. Then, in a swift motion, one candle was extinguished, not by wind, but by breath. Darkness pressed in, broken only by the faint glow of the hearth. And in that darkness, low and urgent, came a voice, not booming, but close, as if whispered from just behind her chair. "Stop asking questions, old woman." The words slithered into the silence, chilling in their menace. A murmur rose, chairs scraped, someone relit the candle. Yet no face confessed to the hissing voice. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely, though her heart beat faster beneath her shawl. "Ah," she thought, her eyes sharp in the restored light, "so the spider has begun to feel my tread upon its web." The hissed warning might have unsettled another woman, but Miss Marple had long since learned that threats were merely proof one was drawing near the truth. She smoothed her shawl with calm fingers and let the conversation resume around her as if nothing had happened. Inwardly, however, she was sharpening her thoughts, pulling at threads until a pattern began to emerge. She had seen this before. Oh yes, many times. A petty theft concealed beneath gossip, a quarrel masked as kindness, a romance that soured and left bitterness in its wake. Human nature, she knew, never truly changed. It simply put on different costumes. Tonight, those costumes were pearls, pressed suits, and polished manners. Beneath them lurked envy, jealousy, and long-nursed resentment. As the villagers resumed their chatter, Miss Marple set her trap with a delicate hand. She did not accuse, nor did she interrogate. Instead, she told small stories, local tales of betrayal and folly that seemed harmless, yet pricked her listeners like hidden thorns. She recalled the baker's daughter who poisoned her rival's pigeons, the farmer who forged letters to keep an inheritance from his cousin, the curate who courted two sisters at once. Each anecdote was chosen with care, each glance she gave weighted with suggestion. Lady Caroline shifted uncomfortably when Miss Marple spoke of envy between old friends. Edward paled when she recalled the curate's divided affections. Even the vicar's wife turned her eyes down at the mention of concealed letters. One by one, the masks slipped, if only for a heartbeat. The room grew taut, like a web straining under the movement of its prey. Miss Marple, the quiet spider at its center, felt each tremor. It was not Clara, the frightened maid, who had woven this design of death. Nor was it Edward, though his nerves made him appear guilty. And Lady Caroline's bitterness, though real, lacked the cold precision required for foxglove tincture and secret notes. No, someone else sat quietly, biding time, their guilt hidden behind the very ordinariness of their presence. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the vicar, then on his wife, then on the gardener who lingered in the shadows. One of them, she thought, had far more to lose if Lydia Harrington's secrets ever came to light. She rose at last, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, and gave a gentle smile. "It is often so," she said conversationally, "that truth hides not in loud quarrels or dramatic gestures, but in the small things, a tone of voice, a gesture at the wrong moment, a letter that appears and then vanishes." Her words fell like quiet stones into still water, sending ripples through the gathered guests. Nobody spoke, but every face seemed more rigid than before. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and added, as if it were the simplest of requests, "I should like us all to meet once more in Mrs. Harrington's drawing-room. I believe it is only fitting we honor her memory properly, with every one of her friends and acquaintances present." She paused, letting the silence deepen. "And perhaps, at last, we may find the truth waiting there." Chapter 7. The Mistress and the Poison. The drawing-room at Harrington House still bore faint traces of its former mistress, silken drapes chosen with impeccable taste, the faint scent of lavender sachets lingering in the air, and the gleam of polished mahogany furniture. Yet now the room seemed cloaked in unease. Every creak of the firewood, every tick of the clock on the mantelpiece sounded louder, sharper, than it ought to. Miss Marple sat primly in the high-backed chair by the hearth, her knitting bag resting at her side, as if this were no more than a quiet afternoon call. But before her, arranged in a stiff semicircle, sat Lady Caroline in her widow's silks, Edward Pritchard with eyes that darted nervously from one corner to another, Clara the maid pale and trembling, the vicar and his wife, and even the gardener, hands folded but knuckles white. Each had been summoned, none had dared refuse. On the low table lay the familiar tea service, its porcelain cups painted with fading violets. A ghostly reminder of the fate. Miss Marple had seen to its placement herself, for symbolism mattered, and memory was a sharper spur than any accusation. "My dear friends," she began, her voice as mild as warm milk, "we all remember too clearly the events of that dreadful day. Poor Mrs. Harrington, so suddenly taken from us." She let the words hang in the air before continuing. Yet the truth has a way of whispering through, even when men attempt to bury it in gossip or fear. She poured the tea with steady hands, her eyes never once leaving the faces of her company. A cup was taken, you see, with something more than tea inside. That is where our story begins, and where, I think, it must end. Her gaze shifted, not accusingly, but with a softness that unsettled. Foxglove tincture. Not an accident. Not the work of an ignorant servant. Someone knew precisely what they were doing. Edward coughed, fumbling with his cufflinks. Lady Caroline's lips tightened to a bloodless line. Clara sniffled into her handkerchief. Only the vicar's wife sat unervingly still. Miss Marple continued, recounting the sequence of the fete, the laughter, the music, the steaming cups of tea, and with each detail she directed a question here, a glance there. "You were at the table, were you not, Lady Caroline? You carried the seed cake, Clara. And you, Edward, claimed the library, yet a scrap of wax was found in your pocket. Curious, is it not?" One by one, the suspects shifted, stumbled over explanations, their composure unraveling stitch by stitch. Miss Marple sipped her own cup serenely, as if she had all the time in the world. Then, with hands that seemed deceptively frail, she poured one more cup, deliberately, almost ceremoniously. The dark liquid swirled within the porcelain, the very image of menace cloaked in domesticity. She lifted it, held it out toward one particular suspect, and said softly, "Perhaps you will take this, my dear, as you once did before." The room froze. Every breath caught, every eye widened, and Miss Marple, her own expression serene, watched with hawk-like eyes. The silence stretched, long and taut as a violin string. All eyes turned toward the fragile cup in Miss Marple's outstretched hand. Lady Caroline's jeweled fingers trembled as she reached for it, then froze mid-air, her face paling. A tremor passed through the room like a chill draught, and Miss Marple, satisfied, set the cup gently back upon its saucer. "My dear Lady Caroline," she said softly, "you need not drink, for you already have." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Edward half rose from his chair, then sank back, uncertain. The vicar's wife pressed a hand to her lips. Clara sobbed quietly into her kerchief. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her voice calm, almost sorrowful. It was never Clara, nor Edward, nor any humble servant who plotted such a crime. It was you, Lady Caroline. Your friendship with Mrs. Harrington was deep once, but soured long ago. You envied her inheritance, her place, and, most of all, her companionship with Mr. Pritchard. Edward flushed scarlet, but Miss Marple pressed on gently. When your affection was not returned, jealousy set in. That bitterness, I fear, became as poisonous as the foxglove itself. Mrs. Harrington had threatened to reveal the truth, the dreadful secret you carried. She had the letter, did she not? But it vanished, destroyed in your fire. Lady Caroline's lips moved, but no words emerged. Her hands clutched her lap so tightly the knuckles gleamed white. Miss Marple's eyes, kind yet unyielding, held her fast. At the fete, you offered her tea with a smile, and beneath that smile lay your vengeance. Later, when suspicion began to circle, you feared Edward might betray you, or worse, that his own foolish innocence might cast fresh doubt upon you. And so you sought to silence him as well, using the same tea service, the same deadly draught. The clock ticked heavily on the mantel. The fire hissed as a log shifted. At last, Lady Caroline gave a strangled cry, the sound of pride snapping under the weight of truth. "Yes," she gasped, rising to her feet, her composure unraveling. "Yes, it was I. She took everything, her jewels, her place, her companionship with Edward. I could not bear it any longer. I loved him, and she flaunted herself before me as though I were nothing but a relic to be pitied." Her voice broke into sobs, raw and unguarded. She said she would expose me, shame me before the parish, laugh at my desperation. I would not allow it. I only meant to rid myself of her, not to— Her words crumbled, drowned by weeping. The room sat in stunned silence. Edward's face was ashen, Lady Caroline's tears striking him like blows. Clara pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, while the vicar murmured a prayer beneath his breath. Miss Marple remained still, her expression touched with sorrow, yet resolute. She had seen it all before. Love turned sour, devotion curdled into hatred. Human frailty, repeating itself endlessly. At last, Lady Caroline collapsed into her chair, her confession echoing in the hush. Chapter 8. Snowfall after the storm. The next morning dawned pale and hushed, as though the world itself were weary of the night's revelations. Snow drifted lazily from a sky the color of pewter, settling thick upon the hedgerows, softening Marleycomb's lanes into dreamlike quiet. Yet beneath that blanket of white, the village stirred with whispers sharp enough to cut through any peace. Lady Caroline had been led away before midnight, her furs trailing in the snow, her face hidden beneath a veil of tears. The constable's lantern bobbed as he guided her to the waiting motor car, while villagers, drawn from their houses by curiosity, looked on in silence. Some murmured pity, "Poor woman, driven mad by loneliness," while others shook their heads grimly. It was pride that did it, pride and spite. By morning, gossip flowed as freely as tea. In the snug of the tea shop, women gathered over seed cake, dissecting every glance, every word Lady Caroline had spoken in the past month. At the post office, men leaned on the counter, speculating about trials and sentences. Children repeated half-heard tales in the snow, turning tragedy into play with frightening ease. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly by the fire in Mrs. Linton's parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly. Her face, calm and mild, betrayed none of the storm of thoughts behind her pale blue eyes. She had seen many crimes, in many guises. Some born of greed, some of fear, but the darkest, always, were born of love gone sour. Love could nurture, could sustain, but when mingled with envy and wounded pride, it could rot into something deadly, a poison far subtler than foxglove tincture. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's rang faintly through the snow-laden air, summoning villagers to prayer. A fitting balm, perhaps, for a shaken community. Order, in its way, was being restored. Clara had been released, her innocence proven. Edward walked about pale but alive, his future uncertain yet unshadowed by suspicion, and the village, though scandalized, clung to its routines, the very thing that gave Marleycombe its resilience. And yet, Miss Marple's gaze was not entirely at rest. At the edge of the gathering crowd that morning, as Lady Caroline had been taken away, she had noticed a small, curious thing. Mr. Pierce, the schoolmaster, a quiet man seldom remarked upon, had bent swiftly, almost furtively, as though retrieving a handkerchief from the snow. But what he slipped into his pocket was no handkerchief. It was a fragment of paper, jagged along its edge, stamped with the unmistakable sheen of green wax. The missing seal. Miss Marple did not stir, did not remark upon it. Her needles continued their rhythm, her lips pursed in thought. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps only a keepsake, a scrap borne on the wind. But her instincts, honed by years of observing the small sins and secrets of human nature, whispered otherwise. In Marleycombe, as in every village, no secret ever truly stayed buried. The fire snapped loudly, startling the silence. Miss Marple looked into the flames, her expression unreadable. The storm had passed, yes, but snow could cover much, and beneath its surface the ground still held mysteries waiting to thaw. The evening crept gently over Marleycombe, the snow outside turning pearl-gray beneath a waning moon. Miss Marple's cottage, set back from the lane with its climbing roses now bare and brittle with frost, glowed softly from within. Inside, the hearth burned steadily, casting golden light upon shelves of well-thumbed books and the neat armchair where she so often sat with her knitting. She moved with her usual quiet economy, setting a tray upon the little oak table. A silver pot, steaming with freshly brewed Darjeeling, stood beside a plate of scones, spread already with blackcurrant jam. Her needles rested in a wicker basket at her side, the soft pink yarn waiting patiently until her hands were free again. Miss Marple lowered herself into her chair, sighing faintly, not from fatigue but from the gravity of reflection. She poured her tea with the same precision she brought to all things, watching the amber liquid swirl. For a long while she sat in silence, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the distant hush of snowflakes brushing against her window-panes. So it had been Lady Caroline, a woman betrayed by her own pride, undone by jealousy disguised as devotion. Miss Marple's thoughts turned not to the crime itself, gruesome though it was, but to the tender weakness at its heart. Human nature, she mused, was a tapestry both fragile and strong. Love in its pure form could bind wounds, inspire patience, endure hardship. Yet twist it with envy, lace it with humiliation, and it became something else entirely, a poison more bitter than any tincture. Her needles resumed their soft click, click, click. Each stitch, she thought, was not unlike the patterns of human behavior. A single loop dropped, a single tension altered, and an entire design could unravel. How easily, too, the heart could slip its careful pattern, straying into ruin. Outside, Marleycombe slept soundly. Chimneys puffed gentle smoke, children dreamed beneath quilts, and the church stood sentinel under its cloak of snow. Peace, it seemed, had returned. And yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances altogether. Every village harbored secrets. Every heart, no matter how seemingly tranquil, carried shadows that might never see daylight. She sipped her tea slowly, the warmth spreading through her like reassurance. Yet even as she savored the comfort, a thread of unease lingered. The image of Mr. Pierce stooping for that torn fragment of green wax pressed at the edge of her mind. She tucked it away, for now, knowing time often unraveled what haste could not. The fire gave a soft sigh, sparks drifting upward like fleeting thoughts. Miss Marple folded her hands at last, her knitting set aside, her gaze resting upon the dancing flames. A smile ghosted her lips, gentle, almost wistful. "One can never truly know the depths of a heart," she murmured, her voice barely more than the crackle of embers, "until the poison rises." The flames flared briefly, as if in answer, then settled into their steady glow. And the village slept on, wrapped in snow and silence, unaware of the quiet guardian who kept its truths. And so, dear friends, our winter tale in the village of Marleycombe draws to its quiet close. Snow still lies deep upon the hedgerows, muffling the lanes where gossip once rang sharp as bells. The hearths burn steadily once more, the tea-shop hums with laughter again, and children skate upon the frozen pond as though no shadow had ever touched the season. Order, it seems, is restored. Yet if we have learned anything from poor Mrs. Harrington's fate, it is that the line between love and malice is as delicate as frost upon a window-pane. A kind word can warm the heart like a fire, but a slight, nursed too long, may grow bitter and perilous. Every village holds both kindness and cruelty, every heart the capacity for both healing and harm. Miss Marple, in her quiet wisdom, knows this truth too well, that poison does not always lie in a cup. Sometimes it lingers in pride, envy, or unspoken longings. She returns to her cottage, her knitting in her lap, the fire glowing gently before her. And as Marleycombe settles under its winter quilt, we are left with her reflection. One can never truly know the depths of a heart until it is tested, by love, or by the poison love can become. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me in this journey through snowy lanes and whispered secrets. Your company, like a good cup of tea, makes the telling warmer. Now I wonder, what do you think? Is love the sweetest cure, or the deadliest poison? Share your thoughts below, and let us continue the conversation together. Until next time, may your fires burn bright and your hearts stay kindly.